Good evening and welcome to our Bible study tonight with Narkis Street congregation in the book of Acts. And we continue on with the latter part of Acts and Paul in Jerusalem for the final time and here at the temple at Shavuot. And let's open in prayer. Lord, thank you for our chance to be here together as a community to read your word and to just let your Holy Spirit guide us, reveal things to us, and open our eyes to new things that we've never seen before. And we ask that you would do that in our own lives as well. In your name we pray, Jesus. Amen. Okay, so a quick summary of last Bible study. When Paul got to Jerusalem in Acts 21, you remember he came with a team of disciples. Some were Jewish, some were Gentiles, and they had been collecting money abroad from the West, from the different churches over there in Ephesus, in Asia Minor, Corinth, and Greece, and up in Macedonia as well, like Philippi and so on, Thessalonica. And they brought these monies back to Jerusalem to the church there. And Paul had gone in to see James, the brother of Jesus, who was the head of the church, and the elders. And they told Paul that they had heard a rumor about him that was being said that he was teaching Jews in the diaspora to stop observing the law, the Torah, like not to circumcise their sons. And they said, well, obviously we know your character, Paul, and but you've got to show people out there that that's not the case. So when you go to worship in the temple, I guess in the next day or whatever, go with these four men who are doing Nazirite vows and pay for their sacrifices to show that you are still a law-abiding, Torah-observant Jew. And so Paul did that. He went into the temple. But there were some Jews, it says, that were from Asia Minor and from the diaspora, and they saw him, and apparently they knew him, and they started shouting to people around them that he had brought Greeks into the temple. And so, as we know, he had some Gentiles with him in his team, but it says nothing about them going into the temple with him at that moment. A crowd grabs Paul and they start beating him. And so this is where we are tonight, Acts 21, verse 31. While they were trying to kill Paul, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and he ran to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with two chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I am a Jew from Tarsus and Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and he motioned to the crowd. When they were all silent, he said to them in Hebrew. And before we get to what he exactly said in Hebrew, I want to start tonight by asking this question. Why are so many people upset with Paul in Jerusalem that it would cause a riot in the temple during this festive occasion of Shavuot, of Pentecost, where so many Jews have come up to celebrate one of the three pilgrimages to Jerusalem. Why would they be so upset with Paul being connected to Gentiles here in 57 AD? So, the first thing to pay attention to as we've done this Bible study in Acts, we started essentially in Acts 2 with after the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus, the disciples or apostles are all waiting in Jerusalem for the Holy Spirit that comes at Pentecost or Shavuot in Acts 2. So you'll notice we've kind of come full circle with Jerusalem and celebrating Pentecost. First time it was with Peter and the original disciples, and now we only hear about Paul at Pentecost in Acts 21 by name. James is mentioned meeting with Paul, but it doesn't say he's not connected to this story of the riot in the temple. So one question I want to ask is what's changed in the last 27 years since that first Pentecost of Acts and now with this last Pentecost of Acts? And even more, I want to ask the other question, a deeper question. The Romans have been ruling Judea and Jerusalem for 120 years. What's gone on in those 120 years that have brought the Jewish people here in Jerusalem to such a time of foment? And one other thing to think about, and I don't think I will answer this. Last Bible study, we pointed out how James, when he was talking to Paul, he said, "Do you see all of these myriads of Jewish believers in Jesus and how they're all zealous for the law?" And we talked about how myriad is actually in Greek means 10,000. So these tens of thousands of Jewish believers in Jesus, they're all zealous for the law here in Jerusalem, I guess at this celebration of Pentecost. But where are they now in this story where Paul's getting jumped on? You'd think at least a few of them would be around Paul protecting him. So to answer these questions, I want to go back to the beginning of Roman rule in Judea, which was 120 years prior. In 63 BC, there was a Jewish civil war going on in this country between two Hasmonean brothers, Hyrcanus II and Aristobulus II, and they are descended from the original Hasmonean clan of Mattathias that celebrated every Hanukkah, and particularly Judah, the Maccabee, the Hasmonean, where they fought the Greek occupiers and they kicked them out of the country, and they became the new rulers of this land, and they were Jewish. And so it was Jewish sovereignty, which had been gone for around 400 years. But go into the future from that time of Hanukkah and the cleansing of the temple with Judah, you've got some of his um, descendants, these two brothers, and they are fighting over who should be the king of Judea, this land. And so they invite the Romans to come in to settle the dispute. It's like the chickens inviting the wolf into the chicken coop. And so the Roman general Pompey comes in to Jerusalem and he sieges Jerusalem for 3 months and kills thousands of inhabitants in Jerusalem. And he empowers Hyrcanus to become the new high priest. And but on top of that, what he does is he makes this is when Rome comes in as a power and settles here. And from here on out, they will have say in how Judea is run and ruled. And Pompey is remembered in infamy of Jewish memory for going into the temple and specifically going into the Holy of Holies, which was this sacrilegious act where the throne of God is. And so he will always be remembered in a bad light for doing that. And here is this another Gentile. You've already had the Greeks who are Gentiles, and before that, you had the Babylonians who destroyed the first temple, and now we've got these new Gentiles, the Romans who have come, and they are going to have a presence and have influence and essentially rule this land from here on out. Um, and Judea would become a client kingdom of Rome. So, 20 years or so after Pompey, Julius Caesar, we all know him, decided to make Antipater, the Idumean, the procurator of Judea, which is like a title for governor. And who is Antipater, the Idumean? And where is Idumea? It's down south of Jerusalem. Today we talk about Mareshah, Beit Guvrin down there. It's north of Beersheba, but kind of in between Jerusalem and the coast, going south, going towards Ashkelon. And so Antipater he's an Idumean. He's got two sons, Herod and Phasael, and he will be assassinated 4 years later. And out of this, his son Herod, who we all know as Herod the Great, who will go on to rule in this country for over 30 years, he is, after dealing with all the politics and the story, Rome appoints him as King of the Jews in Jerusalem by the Roman Senate. And so he will come and rule in Jerusalem with the help of the Romans. And he's a Gentile too. Even though his family, the Idumeans, were circumcised, they were forced to be circumcised by the Hasmoneans years earlier when they were conquered by the Hasmoneans, the Maccabees. In Jewish practice, he will often be seen, or Jewish tradition, Herod the Great will be seen as a Gentile. He's not considered a Jew because he also has this pagan side to him where he cozies up to the Romans, and but still he gets this fake title King of the Jews by the Roman Senate. And so again, the Jewish people will hold this grudge against Herod for being this pretender King of the Jews because they don't consider him Jewish, and he's just not a nice person anyways. Um, and so Herod will rule here for 33 years with Roman help, and he's not Jewish, he's a Gentile. And then Herod the Great, we all know, dies. He's buried at the Herodian there near Bethlehem. And he has three sons who will go on to reign in this region, and they will split up his kingdom. Rome, the Roman rulers, the emperor will assign different parts of Herod the Great's old kingdom to his three sons. And the next ruler of Judea will be Archelaus, who will rule here in Jerusalem for 10 years, but he's a terrible ruler. He's the one in the Gospel of Matthew where the family of Jesus runs away to Egypt because Archelaus is this terrible king, if you want to call him that, and who's seeking to, I guess, destroy the children or pretenders to the throne. So that story is mentioned in the beginning of Matthew. But after 10 years, the Roman authorities, they get tired of Archelaus and his incompetence and his cruelty, and he's fired and sent away. And so from this point on, the Romans, they will let the other two sons of Herod rule the Galilee, like Antipas, and Philip the Tetrarch rules up in the area of the near the Golan. But Judea, the Romans will take, and they will appoint from here on out, for the most part, a Roman governor. And they will move the capital from Jerusalem to Caesarea Maritime, which Herod the Great had built prior, but now the Romans will rule, and they will sit out of Caesarea for the throne, and they will come in occasionally to Jerusalem, especially when it's time for the Chagim and the three pilgrimage festivals. So the governors that come with the Romans, you first have Coponius, and he's from 6 to 9 AD. So at this time, Jesus would be around, 13, 14 years old. And what's well known about his time is there's a census taken, and it was a census taken by the Roman governor or ruler of Syria, which included the area of Judea, Quirinius, and his census is mentioned in Luke 2 in relation to the time of Jesus' birth. What's key to this census and historical memory, especially for tonight's Bible study, is his census is about getting to know how many people live in the land and how many will pay taxes to the Romans, because the Romans are looking to squeeze money out of its not citizens, but the people that it occupies. And so a revolt starts with a guy named Judas. So it's not Judas the Maccabean, but it's Judas the Galilean. And he has a group that comes out of his following called the Zealots. It's the Zealots are birthed from Judas the Galilean, and they do not want to pay taxes to Rome, and any Jews that they feel like are helping the Romans, they will target them and attack them. And so part of why they don't want to pay taxes to Rome is paying tribute to Rome is like accepting that Caesar is Lord, and from their perspective. And Josephus talks about their ideology, the zealot ideology, as being no Lord but God, right? Yud He Vav He, the biblical Lord. And so these zealots are birthed at this time at the beginning of the first century. Josephus is the one who talks the most about them. He calls them the fourth philosophy behind Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. Those are the first three. And the fourth philosophy are the Zealots, and they are a resistance movement against the Roman occupation. Occupation. They're founded by Judas the Galilean, and it's this revolt against the Roman census for tax purposes. And ultimately, the zealots are going to be the ones who stay alive inside the national framework of the people. And another 60 years later, there will be a Jewish-Roman war, or the Great Revolt. And it kind of reminds you of a bit back in Acts 5 when the apostles have gone before the Sanhedrin, and they're brought to them, and it's like Peter and John and all of them, and they told them, don't teach in the name of Jesus. um you're determined to make us guilty of this man's blood. And so Peter and the other apostles reply, we must obey God rather than human beings. And it kind of reminds me back at that zealot ideology. There's no Lord, there's no human Lord, but God, right? We must obey God rather than human beings. And so you can see how it's a bit radical, and you could be thinking in revolutionary terms. And that trial of the apostles before the Sanhedrin in Acts 5 continued on, because some of them wanted to kill them, put them to death, stone them. But Gamliel, the Pharisee there, he took a more moderate approach, and he recommended there, let's not hurt them. Yes, there have been these leaders of revolutions or messianic pretenders. Like in verse 36, he talks about Theudas, who appeared with 400 men, and but he got killed, and then all of his followers dispersed. It came to nothing. And then he talked about Judas the Galilean, which goes back, 20 years, 30 years prior, who also led a revolt, and he too was killed, and all of his followers were scattered. And so Gamaliel took an approach of, if this is a truly a messianic movement and it's not of human origin and God's really behind them, it will not fail. But if we get involved in this, um, we don't want to fight God if they truly are from God. So he gave a very kind of nuanced interpretation of the early church there, and we're going to talk about Gamliel in a little bit more in this Bible study. But as the Roman governors continue on, another one of note is in red there, Valerius, and he started to replace the high priest. And so this would be the time that Jesus is, he's a young man. He's in his 20s. He's not quite yet at the time of ministry. He's almost there. And Valerius, the Roman governor of Judea, he starts deposing high priest. Now, normally the high priest was a lifetime appointment, kind of like being made a Supreme Court judge. But Valerius threw that rule out the window and just started doing what he wanted. And so there was a whole line of different high priests every year or every so many months up until he appointed Caiaphas, which we all know Caiaphas from the trial of Jesus. And but what this shows you here is that when you start breaking the rules that have been set in place as checks and balances on power, you allow corruption to creep in, because now the Roman governors are ensuring loyalty, because the high priest is no longer responsible to God. He's responsible to this governor. And if the Roman governor does not like what he's doing, he can fire him. And also, they're gonna want money, right? They've done these census, and they're levying taxes, and so where's a lot of the money? A lot of the money is going into the temple, especially during the time of pilgrimages, 3 times a year. Lots of money is flowing around the temple area, and so the Romans are gonna squeeze the high priest or the priestly families for a piece of that economic action. And so corruption is creeping in, even though it's already been there. And then we get our well-known, very famous, infamous Pontius Pilate. And he's going to rule for 10 years. And he's most famous in our memories with the trial of Jesus. He, Josephus gives a number of events where Pilate was reactive, foolish, insensitive, cruel, and violent. And that's kind of the memory that we have of him. And as you know, he sat in Caesarea Maritime there on the ocean, just to the northwest of Jerusalem. And they've even found in the theater area of Caesarea an inscription with his name on it, Pontius Pilate. But like just a few of the incidents that Pilate did, which were really stupid. He brought Roman military standards that bore the image of Caesar into Jerusalem by night. And of course, that's idolatry and Jewish understanding. And so it caused a riot. And eventually, he took those images out of the city, I guess back to Caesarea, which was, a place that you had, it wasn't the holy city of the Jews. Another time, he took money from the temple treasury to finance an aqueduct to supply water to Jerusalem. And when people protested, he sent in soldiers to beat them up, and some of them were killed. Another time with the Samaritans just north of Jerusalem, there was a leader who claimed to be Moses reincarnate, and Pilate sent troops in and killed a lot of people. And so the Samaritans and the Jews would appeal to the person above Pilate, which was always the governor of Syria, Vitellius, and they eventually got Pilate fired and he was sent back to Italy. But not after he'd already been there 10 long, painful years. And so we know with the trial of Jesus, Pilate was present and very much involved. But also, he would have been around the first chapters of Acts. He would have been in Jerusalem from Acts 1 to Acts 9. So even though he's not mentioned, he was in power of Judea. And then after Pilate's gone, we have another incident with Marullus, 37 to 41, where he has to deal with the Roman Emperor Caligula, who was crazy and wanted to put a statue of himself up in the Temple of Jerusalem. And Marullus actually was seemed to be a reasonable ruler, and he saw that this would cause a catastrophe, a war even among the Jews, and he kept stalling. And fortunately, Caligula died, and the new Emperor Claudius, he, you know, d- canceled that order about putting a statue up. But that story really reminds you of going back to Hanukkah and the Greeks when they defiled the temple under Antiochus IV, Epiphanes, and put statues and idols and um, desecrated the temple here in Jerusalem. And so, again, the Gentiles, which are represented by the Romans now, are leaving a really bad taste in the mouth of the Jewish people here. Now, there's a few years where the Jewish people were happy here in Jerusalem because Herod Agrippa came along. He's the grandson of Herod the Great, and he was friends with Caligula and Claudius, the two concurrent emperors, Roman emperors, and they put Agrippa in power to be the next ruler of Judea, and they even called him King of Judea. And he goes on, Agrippa the first goes on to have this, he's quite remembered well in Jewish history, and he even built back up Herod the Great's former kingdom. He added all the pieces of Galilee and the northern part, as well as Judea, Samaria. But in our Acts Bible study, we also, the the writer of Acts sees Herod Agrippa in a very bad light. Because first off, he cut the head off of James, and he imprisoned Peter and was going to also kill him as well. And his rule happened quickly and ended suddenly. It was only 3, 4 years long. and then he was gone. And the story in Acts 12 and in Josephus both talk about he was in a theater, an amphitheater in Caesarea, and he was being proclaimed to God by the people, and essentially God struck him down through an angel or some sort. Now, after Agrippa's gone, we go back to the Romans, where they bring in their foreign governors. And this is the time when Cuspius Fatus is the governor, that this Theudas, who was this pretend Messiah, um, appeared, that Gamaliel talks about in Acts 5. And so Cuspius Fatus is the one who suppressed Theudas at that time. And Josephus gives the details, gives more details as well in his Antiquities, where he talks about the people followed him to the Jordan River, and he was a prophet, and he was going to divide the water like Joshua did, and they were going to cross over it. Um, but Faddus, who the Roman governor, sent his troops out there and killed them and cut off Theudas' head, just like Herod Agrippa did to the head of James. And so now, as we're coming up to our time with Paul, we've got another governor who's very interesting. His name's Tiberius Julius Alexander, and he is a Jew. It's very fascinating. He's a diaspora Jew. He's the nephew of Philo. So remember, Philo is this great Jewish philosopher and thinker, huge mind. He's wrote a lot about an allegory, and their family are Egyptian Jews. Alexandria is the capital there in Egypt, and they've been there generations. And so Tiberius is his nephew, but unfortunately, Tiberius goes on to want to be more Roman than he is Jewish. In a sense, he leaves his Judaism behind, and he climbs the political ladder and becomes um, all kinds of things in the Roman system. He's a governor of Judea, 46 to 48. Later on, he's going to be the governor of Egypt, 20 years later. And then in 70, when Jerusalem is being sieged by the Romans after Vespasian is left to become emperor and his son Titus has built the siege wall around Jerusalem, who is there as his second in command? It's Tiberius Julius Alexander, the nephew of Philo. He is the one there as Titus is crucifying Jews outside the city wall and just watching Jewish blood flow. So, on one hand, he goes on to be one of the most successful Jewish soldiers in history, but on the other hand, he's like a collaborator because he essentially turns on his people and serves the Romans and claims that ultimately as his identity. But during his short rule here in Judea, there is that famine that happens in the Mediterranean. We remember from Acts 11 and 12, and when Paul and Barnabas brought money from Antioch down to Jerusalem to help buy food, Tiberius would have been ruling in Jerusalem at that time. Tiberius also goes on to kill the sons of Judas of Galilee. Remember the guy who started the Zealot movement? Well, he crucified the two sons of Judas of Galilee. Judas of Galilee had already been killed 40 years earlier, and then his sons are killed at this time under Tiberius Julius Alexander. All right, one more person before we get to our time with Paul, and we're talking about Cumanus, 48 to 52. And he really is fanning the flames of where we get to in Acts 21 because he's a terrible ruler and he just does not know how to, he's not diplomatic. So um, in 48, there's a riot during the festival of unleavened bread during Passover, where a Roman soldier on temple guard duty mocked Jewish pilgrims by lifting up his tunic and exposing himself. And the crowd riots, and there's a panic, and thousands are trampled or crushed to death. Here's kind of give you an image of you see the arrows are pointing out where the Roman soldiers are standing up above the Temple Mount. And you can even see there's one Jewish worshiper there pointing up at the soldiers. So give you an idea of where the Roman soldier might have done his dastardly deed. And um, so there's this riot, thousands are killed because of, an uncouth Roman soldier. There's other incidents like this that get out of hand and really offend the Jewish people in Jerusalem. Another time in 51, there's a pilgrim going to Jerusalem. He's coming from the Galilee and he's murdered while walking through Samaria, which we all know Samaritans and Jews did not like each other and it was dangerous. And Cumanus, he's supposed to be the ruler of this area, did not seek out justice for this person. He didn't try to find out who had done it. And so there are Jewish zealots who are going to come and they're going to start attacking Samaritan villages. So then Cumanus sends in Roman troops to kill and capture the zealots. And he's just again seems very incompetent in the way he deals with people's emotions and the politics of the situation. And so both Samaritans and Jews will go to the Roman governor of Syria once again to get Cumanus kicked out. And it works. They're able to remove him. Um, but so in all this time, though, the blood is starting to boil between Samaritans and Jews, Jews and Roman soldiers, and it's also and all of these are considered like Gentiles. Samaritans, yeah, they're kind of close to Jews, but they're still not Jews, and the Romans again, and you remember this is when Paul and Barnabas come to Jerusalem for the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15, and they're seeking out what to do about Gentiles who are coming to follow Jesus. And there's a strong contingency of Jewish believers in Jesus in Acts 15 who say those Gentiles need to convert. They need to become Jews if they're going to be a part of us. But James makes that decision saying, no, the Gentile believers don't need to be circumcised. And so that was quite a radical um, suggestion then when you look at what's going on here in the history and the politics of the land, where Gentiles are not very popular there and they are offensive. And so finally, we come to the Roman governor of Acts 21. And this is the time of Antonius Felix. Who is he? He's an ex-slave. He's the first Roman governor who was a former slave but was freed. And um, you could be an educated slave because there were all types of levels at that time. But his character was terrible. Tacitus, a Roman historian, this is what he said about Felix. He said, with the power of a king and the disposition of a slave, he practiced every kind of cruelty and lust. And so his rule is corrupt, it's incompetent, um, just terrible. And because of that, there's a lot of lawlessness. And so people don't feel safe. and you're having more robberies along the road, like you think about the Good Samaritan story. You're having an increase in the zealot movement. So people are seeing this Gentile Roman ruler who's terrible. And so they want to identify with a stronger version of their Judaism. And they're going more to the right, to the zealots. And there's a new group that comes out of the zealots that are called the Sicarii, and they are assassins, and they go around and they're starting to kill fellow Jews who are suspected to be collaborators with the Romans. And essentially, they were terrorists because they caused terror in the hearts of the people because they would kill these prominent individuals in public, and then people would freak out. It would cause terror in them. And, and so it's a movement to try to force people to go over to their side away from trusting the Romans and putting their faith in them. And I mean, at this point, the Romans had already lost that faith, or they were in the process of losing the faith of any Jews who supported their rule. And so Felix would respond to these lawbreakers, these assassins, by crucifying many of them. And sometimes people got tied up and they weren't even guilty and they were crucified as well. There's another story where in Caesarea Maritime, up there in the capital, there was a fight that broke out between Gentiles and Jews, Greek-speaking Gentiles and Jews, and Felix sided with the Gentiles and he looted Jewish property and he executed Jewish leaders. So corruption's increasing, and that corruption you especially see at the temple, where the priestly families are hoarding the money. Obviously, they're having to give a cut to the Roman governor who is corrupt. And because the flow of money is being squeezed from different sides, these priestly families in power decide to cut off money to the lower ordinary priest. And so Josephus talks about there were cases of some of these common priests starving to death because they were not being given anything from the dole for their work at the temple. And so overall, you this is what Paul is walking into Jerusalem now at this time of Shavuot, where you see this moral decay among Jerusalem's leadership. People are angry. They're angry at the corruption, the lack of law. They're angry at the Gentile Roman rulers, especially because they keep giving them these terrible governors who are not competent and they're corrupt. And and so it's causing the people to lean towards more extreme um, leaders like the Zealots. And most historians see this point of time as the point of no return, where the Jews of Judea are no longer going to accept that the Romans can rule them. And it's only a matter of time to when they will rebel, which will come in another 10 years. During this time of Felix, there was a prophet, another prophet, a Messiah figure that comes up from Egypt, leads thousands of followers to the Mount of Olives, and he's claiming that the walls of Jerusalem are going to fall down, I guess like Jericho. So the Roman troops go out there and they kill hundreds and they captured thousands. But that Egyptian prophet escaped. Josephus talks about it. And so here's Paul. Paul shows up in Jerusalem. He goes to the temple. You've got all of this history that's been built up. and he gets in this riot because he's being connected to Gentiles going into the temple, and makes you think about, oh yeah, the Gentiles who want to set up that idol, or the Gentiles who want to do this, or the Gentiles who have been making us do that. It's not popular to be a Gentile at this time, and they're trying to kill Paul. The Romans soldiers grab him, take him to the barracks, and Paul says, "Do you speak Greek?" And so this commander says to Paul, "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" And so here's that Egyptian um, prophet that happened just few years before Paul showed up, um, who escaped. His followers got captured or killed, but he escaped. And so this commander's thinking, you've come back and you've started another revolt here, here at the temple during Shavuot, during Pentecost. And so here's my summary about why are people so on edge and so violent? How could we see Paul walking into all of this? And it's because the Romans are seen as these occupiers of the land. They're Gentile occupiers who've been controlling their customs, forcing political decisions on them, influencing their religious practices. Um, they've corrupted the chief priest of the temple, and these chief priests are abusing the common people, ignoring their needs. And so no wonder the people are restless. And why do they keep going after that messianic potential person, and that guy from Egypt and this one over there? Because they're desperate. They're looking for some sort of hope. And it's also at this time where the Sicarii, these assassins who are going around and they're killing Gentiles in Jerusalem, they're killing Jews who associate with Gentiles because they're all associated with the Roman occupiers. And so Paul, he's brought a group of Jews and Gentiles into Jerusalem. It's not just a religious problem we have here, it's a political problem. And he's in a very dangerous situation. And so the commander that grabs Paul, um, is in Greek, he's a chiliach of the Roman troops, and he's technically a commander of 1,000 men. And so that's a lot of guys. That's not like a centurion who's only in charge of 100. And it says when he brings him back to the barracks, I already kind of showed you in the prior picture there on the bottom left. You see there, it's called the Antonia Fortress, and it's there on the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. And it was built by Herod the Great and named after his friend, the Roman general Mark Antony. And it was specifically built, according to Josephus, on a rock that was higher than everything else. And it had four corners to it. So if you've been to the Israel Museum of late and seen the Second Temple model of Jerusalem, that back here is part of that model with the Antonia Fortress there with the four corners built on top of a high rock. And here's another angle of it looking from the north, and the temple there in the white up to the top. The temple's facing towards the east. And you'll notice that the Antonia, the fortress, is facing towards the temple. And the soldiers are all along the parapet at the top, the walkway, where they could look over and watch the worshipers, especially during the times of pilgrimage like Pentecost and Sukkot and Passover. And that's how that one guy got away with um, flashing himself to the people below him. And so they would stay there, the Roman cohort, the soldiers up in this these barracks of the fortress. And there's some ideas that this fortress would have an additional part lower down. This is Lean Rittmeyer's drawing here, where you have a lower part with a pool and for other common soldiers down at the bottom part there below the fortress. It's an idea. So again, the Roman soldiers were up there on the top looking down, and this is when he asked Paul, when the commander asked Paul, "Aren't you that Egyptian that brought these 4,000 terrorists?" And in Greek there it actually says the Sicarii. You brought these Sicarii with you in this revolt. And so the Sicarios are these dagger men, and they think it comes from sica, which is this Latin word for a short, curved dagger. And as we were saying before, there are assassins. They're small knives, so you can hide them in your clothes, and then you pull them out quickly, stab in an essential body part that would kill the person as quick as possible, and then you run away with the crowd as the other person's dying there. And so the Sicarii are coming out of the Zealot movement that had started like 50 years prior. And it was very much a nationalistic and and it a religious nationalistic movement where they considered killing violence as sacred. And I guess you probably go back to the whole story of Phineas, where Phineas kills those people defiling the camp of the Lord. He kills the woman and the man who were copulating there. So I'm sure they could use that as taking the Bible literally for what they were doing, and so their attacks are increasing during the time of Felix because there's more and more for the people to hate. And so the Sicarii are they're around Jerusalem when Paul is there, and they will go on to kill a high priest, Jonathan, in a couple years after this event with Paul. They'll kill him right there in public, and so they have no shame, and they're very, very dangerous. And so later on, when Paul gets taken to Caesarea, remember he has to have a whole group of Roman soldiers go with him because they're concerned about some guys like the Sicarii coming to kill Paul. And so Paul, he stands on the steps and he's allowed to speak to the people after the Roman commander, gives him permission. So he'd probably be somewhere up there or in another spot with, I guess, steps that would be a doorway down to where the crowds were. It says there, he spoke to them in Hebrew. And when he did, the crowd became quiet. Why would they become quiet? I don't know what your Bibles have, but a lot of translations, like say the NIV, will say Paul spoke in Aramaic. And quite a few English translations will have that. And then there's some, like the King James, will have Paul spoke in the Hebrew dialect. And what it literally has there in the Greek of Acts 21:40 and 22:1 is Evredi dialecto. And which literally means the Hebrew dialect. And there was another phrase if you wanted to say you were speaking in the Aramaic dialect, which would have been Syriaque dialecto. So sort of yo-yo is how they say it today, but for like the Christian Aramaic, and but so Aramaic is really Syrian, and it says that it literally says he spoke in the Hebrew dialect. And Randall Booth, our resident scholar here at Narkis Street, has studied and researched this a lot and written a ton of articles on the um, language environment in first century Judea, and he's shown that there is no unambiguous examples in the Greek literature at that time, like Philo, Josephus, Papias, and some other texts, where this term ever means Aramaic. It always refers to Hebrew. And so, what is going on with the languages that um, give us context for our story tonight is that scholarship, especially New Testament scholarship, has seen that has always talked about there only being two languages um, being used by Jews in this land, Aramaic and some of the Greek, and then the Romans bring some Latin too. But and so like even when you watch your movies about Jesus, you get this thinking that, oh, Jesus is speaking Aramaic here, and so on and so on. But actually, there is quite a bit of evidence that Hebrew was a living language as well at the time. And so you can break it down like this, that Greek is your imperial language here. It's your international language, kind of like what English is today. And so it's used in commerce and government, especially with the Romans ruling here, and your Jews living into the West, they would be speaking Greek as well. And so it's part of, in this land, it would be part of maybe anything involving the Romans, civic and administration. Aramaic would be your common regional lingua franca. It's the widespread language of the East, and it's a middle level spoken register. And so going anywhere from Judea towards the east, Aramaic would be the common language and a trade language. It's something that you could get around with quite easily. But Hebrew would also have been alive and well. On one hand, it's being used in worship and reading the Bible and um, telling stories that are related to the Bible and teachings. Um, and so that's kind of on a high literary level. But there was also a daily speech, vernacular, spoken level that you would find in Judea and Galilee. But outside of Judea and Galilee, you don't have Hebrew. So it's going to be more of a tribal language. It's going to be localized. And um, so most Jews would be bilingual or trilingual, and it depended on the setting. So, like in the setting with Paul, Paul grew up in Tarsus. He grew up in Cilicia. He would for sure have known Greek because that's part of the diaspora. And but we also know that he studied here in Jerusalem. He was raised in Jerusalem. He studied with Gamliel and the elders. So he knew Aramaic and then Hebrew, sorry, that would have been part of this world. And then Aramaic, again, that's just going to be your common trade language that everybody's going to be using in this area. So you would have had Paul would have had all three languages going on. And so when you get to our story tonight and he first asked the Roman commander asked him if he speaks Greek. And so how does Paul reply? He says, "Well, of course, I'm from Cilicia. That's a pretty big city, and you were very well educated there." And so the commander is surprised, and he's like, "Oh, are you the Egyptian?" Well, the Egyptian would have likely the one who's the messianic pretender. If he's Egyptian, he's probably coming from Alexandria because he's going to be a Messiah. He's going to be Jewish, and Alexandria was a huge Jewish population in Egypt, and so they spoke Greek there. And then when he speaks to the people there at the temple and he speaks to them in Hebrew, he's speaking in a colloquial Hebrew, a Hebrew that you would have only have known if you had been raised in Jerusalem or raised in Judea. And it would have people would have been a little surprised, like, you should have spoken Aramaic because that's the common language that we all know, but only certain insiders, people that are part of our tribe know Hebrew. And so here Paul begins to tell his testimony in this colloquial Hebrew. And by the way, this Hebrew eventually goes out of use after Simon Bar Kokhba's revolt in the second century. But that's for another time. But we've got to finish up here tonight that Paul has, he says in his testimony, I've studied at the feet of Gamliel. He's born in Tarsus, raised in Jerusalem, and we all know his pedigree, how he's a Jew of Jews, and he he's not ashamed to admit it, and he's observant of Torah practice, and when he says that I sat at the feet of Gamliel, or I studied at the feet of Gamliel. This is an idiom, a Hebrew Jewish idiom for being a student. If you sit at the feet of a teacher, you are their student, their disciple. And the most famous saying comes in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, where Yosef ben Yoetzer used to say, let your house be a meeting place for the sages and sit in the dust at their feet. So be disciples of the sages, learn from teachers, because that is how you grow closer to God, by growing closer to his word. And so when you have this idiom in use, sitting at the feet or being at the feet of a teacher, of a sage, it's not a casual learning experience, it's an apprenticeship. And so it's real. You're a real student. Lois Tverberg gave a Bible study, I don't know, a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, in Acts 5, and she talked quite a bit about Gamliel, the sage or the master that Paul studied under. And he was the grandson of Hillel, who's quite well known in rabbinic tradition because Hillel is kind of, his teachings have kind of lasted the longest in Jewish interpretation. They've had the most influence. And Gamliel is kind of that bridge from Hillel into the rest of rabbinic interpretation. So he's a very significant player in rabbinic tradition. He was called a Nasi and a Rabban, very high titles. He was head of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem, but more importantly, he was known for his moderate, pragmatic leadership, where he tried to preserve Jewish law and Jewish unity, even under times of like Roman occupation. And he was the one who recommended that the Sanhedrin not punish Peter and John, but to let them go. Paul, he's not like Gamliel. When he was his student, or when he left him as a student, he went as zealous for God. And he was passionate about preserving um, Jewish practice. And so he was there when Stephen was stoned to death, this follower of Jesus, and Saul was there approving. And he went to Damascus in order to find more people like Stephen and to arrest them and throw them into prison. And that he was proud of his identity then as being this one who was zealous for God and being a proud Jew, being faithful to the covenant, and even using violence to enforce Torah observance, which is what he was doing there going to Damascus. And he says, I persecuted the followers of the way, of this way, to their death. Yes, pretty harsh stuff here that Paul is admitting to this crowd at the Temple Mount here in Pentecost. We talked about it last Bible study. In his writings, he mentions it over and over. I was extremely zealous for the traditions of my fathers. I persecuted the church of God, trying to destroy it, persecuting the church, he writes in Philippians 3. And then he has this bright light blind him. And Jesus of Nazareth speaks to him. And then he tells him to go to Damascus. And there he meets Ananias, who was a devout observer of the law, of the Torah, highly respected by all the Jews living there. And then he tells him, um, Ananias tells Saul or Paul, receive your sight. And then he tells him that the God of our ancestors has chosen you to know his will and to see the righteous one and to hear words from his mouth. You will be his witness to all people of what you have seen and heard. And now, what are you waiting for? Get up, be baptized, and wash your sins away, calling on his name. We don't have too much time to go into it tonight. Maybe we'll save this for next Bible study. But to compare the original story from Acts 9 of when Paul was on his way to Damascus and how he recounts it when he's telling the people now in Jerusalem at Pentecost. What's fascinating in all of this is as he's telling the people here in Jerusalem, these observant Jews that have come to celebrate the festival of Pentecost, he's expressing his Jewish identity and the journey that he's been on as a Jew, seeking with zealousness to really love God, to serve God, doing whatever it took to be obedient to his word and how he interpreted what that meant. And so he's telling the people in the crowd, he's talking to them like their family. He calls them brothers and fathers. He talks about how he was raised in Jerusalem. He's a local. He's speaking Hebrew. He's a student of Gamliel, who was a very well-known rabbi or sage. How he studied the law, the Torah of the fathers. And he says, I was like you. I was zealous for God. We're the same, he's trying to say. He gives the examples of how he used to use violence to support his faith. He even got approval from the high priest and the elders to go to Damascus, and how he had a letter written to the brothers in Damascus. So the Jewish community in Damascus, they accepted him, was recognized. And then Ananias, who he meets, right? He says he was pious, he was Torah observant, um, and he was well respected by the local Jewish community. So we're not talking about the Messianic Jesus follower community. We're talking about the non-Jesus follower group there in Damascus. Ananias is respected by them. And then Ananias tells Paul, the God of our fathers has chosen you, right? So again, we're going back to the God of the Jews, the God of Israel, the God of the Hebrew scriptures. Um, all of what Paul is trying to tell the people, what he's trying to communicate is he is just like them. He is no different than them. The only difference is he's had this experience with Jesus, the Messiah, and it's changed his worldview. And so he continues to tell the people as we finish up here, when when he returned from Damascus to Jerusalem, he went to the temple in Jerusalem and prayed, and I fell into a trance. And I saw the Lord speaking to me. Quick, he said, leave Jerusalem immediately, because the people here will not accept your testimony about me. Lord, I replied, these people know that I went from one synagogue to another to imprison and beat those who believe in you. And when the blood of your martyr Stephen was shed, I stood there giving my approval and guarding the clothes of those who were killing him. Right? So Paul feels this remorse and he realizes what he's done and how will they ever believe him that he's changed? He's no longer the violent man that he used to be. And then the Lord said to me, go, I will send you far away to the Gentiles. So what's interesting, I had not paid attention to till tonight, is that on the way to Damascus, Paul had this experience with Jesus, this revelation. Um, but then he returned to Jerusalem from Damascus and he goes to the temple to pray, the very temple he's in right now, that as he's giving his testimony to the people at Pentecost. And when he's praying in the temple, he gets another revelation from Jesus, from the Lord. And Jesus tells him, go, I'm going to send you far away to the Gentiles. And if you remember back in Acts 9, when God was talking to Ananias about Saul, God tells Ananias, this man is my chosen instrument to proclaim my name to the Gentiles and their kings and to the people of Israel. And now Paul was being told the same thing by God in the temple after he's returned from Damascus. Both of these messages are that Paul is being sent to the Gentiles. And we know that he is the key cog to a lot of the Gentile ministry that begins for the church. That first trip when he and Barnabas go to the West, they find an open door to the Gentiles. And because of that, the Jerusalem Council happens, where the Jerusalem Council is full of these Jewish believers, and they've got to decide, what do we do with these Gentiles, the Gentiles that our people really don't love because of all the political situations that are going on now in our land. What are we going to do with these Gentiles? And so the conclusions tonight, really, I see Jerusalem and the temple as being center for everything. We see how it's the it's the main problem in the political turmoil with the Roman occupation. The Romans, who are these Gentiles that are really messing things up and leading things to go bad, and they're all signs are pointing towards a Jewish revolt, which will come in the near future. And here's Paul showing up into Jerusalem. He had a revelation from Jesus 20 something years earlier that he would go to the Gentiles. What a dangerous calling to be in. And so when the crowd hears Paul say that he's being sent to the Gentiles, that this is what the revelation that Jesus gave him in the temple as he was praying 23 years earlier. What does the crowd do now? They raise their voices and shout, "Rid the earth of him. He's not fit to live." And yet, Paul does not see himself as this collaborator that the Sicarii are going around killing. He doesn't see himself as a traitor to his people. He sees himself actually as a true Jew, a completed Jew, a Jew who's found his Messiah, who has his ultimate purpose for living. And he's experienced Jesus as the Messiah. And he's now able to read the Hebrew scriptures. And I think he would be able to open up the prophet Isaiah and see where God talks about Israel being the light to the nations, being a light to the Gentiles, and how salvation was going to go out to them through Israel. And Paul now understands that as Jesus, he is this light that has gone out to the nations, that Paul has brought on his journeys and his teachings and the way he reads scripture and the synagogues in the diaspora. And it's through Jesus, the Jewish Messiah, that brings completeness and wholeness to all, both Jews and Gentiles.